So let's look at something beginning with regards to, give me 1 second, why is he saying this? So let's look at the aspect of strategic resource management in general. And here what we are looking at is, in particular, now what is, let's look at HRM. Now HRM, this is a term that we've used and we've come across quite often, which is, strategic HRM. Now, human resource management basically refers to the term wherein within organizations, people and staff or, employees are considered as resources. And when you work within different departments, say whether it's a finance department, operation, engineering, marketing, sales, you're considered as one of the key resource who's actually working within that department to be able to help fulfill that objective. And from that aspect, what we say is the management of those resources. When you look at your annual results, when you look at your discussions and meetings with your boss or your manager, line manager, and when you also look at accomplishing your sales goals or targets, targets and goals which are given on a monthly, weekly, monthly basis, yearly basis, that management is basically nothing but management of human resource to be able to ensure that there is a coordinated response to the set of aims and objectives laid out by the organization to achieve the long-term goal which the organization is working towards. Now, the term strategic gets added is when human resources department or human resources management actually looks at planning its activities, keeping in mind the company's expansion in the long run. So it could be 3 to 5 years, it could be 5 to 10 years. And when you know that, say, for example, most manufacturing companies, like let's look at Jaguar Land Rover. So JLR in the UK, when it looks at expanding into emerging market like China, and they set up a plant, this kind of a decision, which they will employ in opening up a manufacturing facility there, a lot of planning will require to be done in terms of human resources, like, for example, the availability of engineers, people who will work within the ships and the factory, requires meticulous planning. And when a company looks at making such a move, the word strategic gets added to HRM, and that becomes strategic human resource management, because the decision being taken has been aligned and it is in line with the expansion which the company is looking at achieving in, say, the Chinese market. So in short, when we look at strategic resource human resource management, or SHRM, it talks about the involvement of development of consistent, aligned collection of practices, programs and policies to facilitate the achievement of organizations' goal in the long term. So JLR, for example, would have kept a long-term goal to capture 5 to 7% of the Chinese auto market. Now, in order for that to happen, it makes a plan which will be a strategic marketing or an plan. And with that plan in mind, the HR department starts to put into practice something called the Strategic Human Resource Management Program, which is nothing but the process of recruiting, developing, training, and redeployment of resources within the Chinese operations to help fulfill the overall organizational objective. Is that okay?
Yeah.
The second bit that we look at is sometimes it requires, when this kind of planning happens, sometimes it requires a different approach. It requires approach which is non-traditional. So sometimes what we do mention is that it requires abandoning the mindset and practices of personal management and focuses on the issues which are strategic and not operational. So the sentence here means is that when you look at long-term planning and when you look at planning in terms of expansion in a company's context, what tends to happen is the HR department tends to plan slightly differently, and that side of the function is clearly differentiated from something called personal management. And here, the scenario that you would look at is if you have HR department within, say, the big fours, like Tesco, for example. Now, Tesco is a well-established business in the UK. They've been running for a number of years. Their manpower requirements in terms of, when you look at recruitment requirements in terms of their stores, do not vary drastically. What tends to happen is there's an X amount of employees which are recruited when a new store is opened up. But if in the middle somebody ends up leaving, or there are issues, or because of which an employment is terminated, these kind of operational issues become kind of run of the mill, because as a departmental store or as a store within the company's overall strategy, the HR manager is able to manage those issues, and that kind of only relate to something called personal management. That means he needs to ensure the number of headcount in a store is there, and if some end up leaving or have employment terminated, new recruitment needs to be done. But there is no strategic thing about it in terms of so throw in an example here would be, if the general manager of a particular store is leaving, then the HR manager there will need to recruit somebody who can come in and step into his shoes. And there, the recruitment for somebody at the management level would become a strategic issue rather than a normal operational issue. So somebody leaving at the floor level, somebody leaving at maybe one of the supervisors leaving because he's got a better job employment opportunity, does not constitute something like a strategic issue. It's more of an operational issue for the HR, that they need to keep finding staff because there's a bit of a staff turnover which happens during the course of the operations in the store. But a strategic issue arises when there is somebody key enough in the management who ends up leaving, and they have to then recruit somebody who is able to provide leadership, direction, and manage the staff within the store, and that then becomes a strategic issue. So is that sentence and differentiation clear between personal management and strategic management in terms of HR?
Yeah.
Okay, good stuff. The last is when we look at integration of all HR programs within a larger framework, which facilitates the organizational mission and objectives. So when you look at the terminology of CXOs or CXX, which is Operating Officer, Chief Financial Officer, Chief HR Manager, or Chief HR Officer. So these kind of terminologies have come in is because over the years, what has happened is a lot of organizations and their businesses have now gone beyond a specific country boundaries. So they become global. But when such kind of resource requirement originates, the HR department, somebody who is senior enough within that department, who is kind of the chief operating officer of the HR department, is then able to look at making decisions which kind of conform with the overall mission and objectives in the long run. So what tends to happen is you will see the chief HR officer will not be involved in the day-to-day operations of running the HR departments if the company has 5 offices. But that person will be looking at aligning HR departments' policies and processes with the overall organizational mission and objectives, keeping in mind the long-term plan, whether it could be a 12 to 18-month plan, 2 to 3-year plan, 3 to 5-year plan. So those kind of things all fall within the remit of SHRM, which is Strategic Human Resource Management. Now, if I have to draw, the role of strategic HRM onto a graph, this is how it will look like. So what you will get to see is that, we look at strategic focus in terms of an operational focus, because within the department, you will always have people who work on 2 aspects. One is there is a day operation, and those day-to-day operations are called operational, operational activities or operational responsibilities. And you must have seen that when you apply for a job, or when you get a job offer, they give you your roles and responsibilities, and in the roles and responsibilities, they break that up into strategic and day-to-day. So day-to-day operational activities are things like when you come into the office, you're replying to emails, you're maybe speaking to your customers, or you're speaking to your peers, and managing the process that you do directly. But the strategic bit becomes the bit which is not required to be done on a daily basis, but you do it once a month or once a quarter. But that thing is to be aligned with the organizational aims and objectives. So an example here would be from an HR perspective. The HR department does usual things like they generate salary slips, they do feedback surveys and all that stuff. But across the year, basically once a year, what they do is they do performance appraisals with the line managers for each employee within the department. Now that is done because it is strategic in nature because of 2-3 reasons. One, if an appraisal is good and the employee performance is meeting the expectation of the organization and the employee is meeting or exceeding, then he's in line for a promotion. He's in line, for a raise in his salary. So those kind of things then become strategic. But if you find that, okay, the person is, doing well, he's coping well with his roles and responsibilities, and is a making valuable contribution in the department overall, then what they tend to do is, okay, this, you look at it this way, that, okay, he's got a number of years to go before he becomes a manager or takes on a supervisory or managerial responsibility. And those kind of things then fall into something called strategic focus. So if I divide this up, so if I look at a quadrant, when you look at, so there are 4 corners: strategic focus, operational focus, and systems and people. HR department also has, certain softwares or processes that it uses to manage and keep and, store this information. And that is all classified as systems, because they will also need, say, a payroll system or an HR system, or a system in which they can keep records for their employees and things like that. And obviously the records are kept and, made available for, people. So sometimes what we tend to do is we divide the roles on the basis of these functions into 4 different types. And there are people who work just on the system. They will become administrative experts, or, people who are familiar with the particular software will work on the software, like generate payroll every month or generate, feedback surveys and things like that. So that becomes operational. And that is an remit wherein within the HR department, somebody will be working within the administration, looking at those day-to-day operational, weekly, monthly, yearly activities. Now, when we look at strategic focus, what tends to happen is sometimes you would see that the HR organizations partner up organizations to retrain and, develop their employees. So suddenly you have to imagine a scenario where there is a requirement for a new resource, and there's a requirement which is propped up, and they want somebody in the department to step into that role. And that role would be a training and development role. So here, what they tend to do is you will engage with maybe a partner or an agency outside. You will look at bringing in some relevant training and development material, and that, using the system, will actually be delivered to all the employees. So one of the elements that you look at within that department would be somebody who is looking at working on one of the key functions within most organizations today, which is, training and development. Sometimes you look at, the HR role as a change agent, and that comes in because if the organization is moving, in line with the requirements of the industry, what tends to happen is the HR department becomes the role bearer, or takes the role of actually introducing change in the organization. And here again, one of the persons within the department is able to champion that role. That person will be called the change agent. An example here would be that during the recession, the recent recession that we faced from 2008, what we've seen, organizations did the downsizing. That means they made redundancies. So here, one of the key persons within the organization or the HR department actually assumes the role of being the change agent. And that person then looks at, strategically shortlisting the right talent and the right amount of people which are required to be able to do that role in that department. And sometimes when you look at these roles which come up and somebody gets deputized to take up that role, then that role becomes something of a role called a change agent. It's a temporary role, but the person who has the expertise, has been with the company for long, understands this, has previous experience in that particular, say function, in this case, say redundancies because of recession and the cost saving factors, is the person who tries to then take up that role within the department for a change agent. Sometimes you have employee champions, and this is a very popular term when you look at most organizations. What tends to happen is the HR department is one of the functions the HR department does is it keeps a tab on whistleblowing. A term called whistleblowing.
Yes.
So when you look at whistleblowing, what tends to happen is that the HR department, gathers information and strategic inputs from various departments and employees within the organization. Now, sometimes what tends to happen is that within the department, there are specific individuals which are aligned with specific requirements for a particular department. So imagine within Tesco, you have a Tesco Extra store, which has maybe up to 250 employees, part-time, full-time. Within that store, there is an HR setup, and that HR setup consists of 3 or 4 people. So there'll be an HR manager, there are 2 assistant HR managers, and there are, administrative assistants. That's the real structure within any Tesco retail store when you look at. Now, when you look at the appraisals, for example, when it comes to the year end, when the appraisals are happening and things like that, what will tend to happen is that the HR manager will actually take up one role. He will work with one particular department. The other, his colleagues will work with the other departments to be able to wrap up that activity. In a sense, what they do is they become eyes and ears, and they work very closely with one odd department within the organization. So if you look at the Tesco store or in general Tesco Extra, you see that there's an electronics section or an electrical section. There's a grocery section. There's a clothing section in most of the stores. In some stores, it has a cafe and other things. And then there's a section which is related to, in general, the customer services manages everything within the store. So so what will happen is the HR manager will work with one such particular department within the store, and his colleagues will work with the others. So they then tend to become something called the employment or employee champions within that particular part of that sub-department. So if there's an issue, if there's a problem which crops up, the first line of protocol or first line of contact in that case becomes that particular person who manages directly that particular department. So somehow that is where what we look at is that sometimes within the HR department, we do look at differentiating roles wherein they are divided into operational, personal management, and also strategic management. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good stuff. Now, let's look at, I've given you some examples, but let's look at clear differences between what is the traditional function of HR as we understand most organizations have had for a number of, decades and years, and how this role is now changing as more and more organizations become global, their businesses become global, and that role is now being transformed into strategic HR. So there's a clear line of differentiation, and these are some of the differences. So when you look at responsibility of HR, traditional HR looks at staff specialists. That means if they want to look at somebody, they will have somebody like an expert in, payroll management, expert in, for example, pensions, expert, for example, in employee relations. And when you look at strategic HR, what you will see is each of this function, because it has become big, that's the reason why you have those differences, that you have personal management, you have pension, you have, employee relations. What they will tend to do is they will have an individual line manager within the department managing those functions. An example here would be that workplace pensions have become mandatory now, as you know. So most employers have to offer workplace pensions to their employees, and the company's contribution is 1% in this year. So what most companies are looking at doing is this is becoming now a specific function within the HR, wherein workplace pensions have to be adopted, and have to be adopted in a sense that they become a part and parcel of the HR department. So a lot of big organizations are actually looking at recruiting somebody who will manage this as a function, and that will be within the HR department, but that line manager will basically look at managing just pensions for the whole organization. Is that clear?
That's okay.
Okay. So the other differences I'll quickly run through will be focused. For example, traditional HR looks at employee relations in general, their welfare, their basic requirements and needs when an employee works within the organization. Strategic HR would look at, partnerships with internal and external customers. And I give you an example here of, training and development. When you look at role of HR, again, role of HR is primarily transactional because they then tend to be change agents, or they tend to be administrative in function. But sometimes when I give you an example of redundancies because of recession, for example, Vodafone made 6,000 redundancies, and that kind of a role required somebody within the HR department to step up, who had been in a previous situation like that, and that then becomes a change leader or a change agent, and it's a transformational role. So these are traditional, some differences between when we look at traditional HR versus strategic HR. Now, last thing that I look at in particular to go through, say when you look at traditional HR, there is something called cost center. So HR department is considered an administrative department, and there are costs associated, because when they look at planning costs in general for the organization, they say, okay, that's the budget for HR this year. That means that includes recruitment, any bit of promotions, surveys, whatever they do. But when you look at strategic HR, that side of function becomes an investment center. What does that investment center function mean? That means that the organization is going to invest into the HR function because it grows the business, or maybe the resource requirements are coming up, which is related to the expansion of the business directly. So what tends to happen is when the business is expanding, what they do is they tend to budget separately for the HR function. They will say, okay, we need to put in some bit of cost here because that will be required to existing employees will have to be retrained and offer training to be able to take up the roles which are coming up in the new setup. And typical example here would be a lot of companies when they migrated from Windows 7 to Windows 10. Now, in the organization, if you're working, you need to be able to make sure that there are employees at all levels which are able to get training and have a smooth transition from falling from Windows 7 to Windows 10. So the IT department comes in, upgrades all the machines, but a lot of employees then tend to struggle to adapt to the new versions of Windows is because they've not had that training. So when such a decision of upgrade tends to happen within organizations from, say, Windows 7 to Windows 10, the organization will also budget, because it's a strategic move, and you have that move within an organization within between 3 to 5 years. When you change the hardware and things like that, they also budget for what you call investment into training and development, and that then becomes something called strategic HR and falls within that. And because there's an investment which needs to be put in so that the employees are becoming more productive while using the latest version of the operating system, contributes to becoming this, in terms of a function, becoming an investment center. Is that okay?
Okay.
Now let's look at some of the barriers, to HR, strategic HR. Some of the barriers are that strategic HR is normally not, short-term focus. It is always long-term focus. There are other things which you look at. Some of these statements are self-explanatory, but if you need any expansion, do let me know. Now, barriers are sometimes HR managers do not think strategically because everyone then becomes comfortable within their role and their function, and they then don't tend to get out of their shell. So if there is an example here would be, as you know, that the workplace requirements are changing now. A lot of companies are today adapting and allowing employees to work from home because it saves on the cost of offices, travel time, and it generally makes the employees much more productive. And this has been proved by a study. Now, if the HR does not think strategically and long-term, see that, okay, because of the availability of technology, broadband, intranet, and infrastructure, it makes much more sense for some of the employees to work, from home. Then if they've not thought of it, then what tends to happen is that they have the inability, or they have not thinking strategically to replan their resources. We look at, from a point of view of long term. When you look at organizations like Google, Facebook, so they are all building this into their strategy for long-term expansion into the UK or post-Brexit, because London will no longer be the center, for most of the jobs. So what will tend to happen is they will want to employ people, wherein if you employ somebody in London, you're paying higher wages and higher salaries. But if you employ somebody sitting in Manchester or Birmingham or Leeds, you might pay a little less salary, but the person might work from home and sometimes visit the office when it is required for meetings and, reviews and things like that.
Yeah.
Sometimes these are barriers because traditional HR managers think traditionally and they lose the ability to be able to think long term or strategically, and that is why this becomes a barrier. Now we also look at lack of appreciation of what HR can contribute. You'll always see that within companies, always sales, marketing, finance, other departments always take away the credit, and sometimes the HR managers do not get the credit for the job they're doing because they're considered administrative or mundane jobs, and that is also one of the barriers. So a lot of times what you will see is the role of HR is becoming important is because the HR department is looking at continuously retraining, reskilling the employees so they are becoming more productive and effective in their job roles. Failure to understand general manager's role as an HR manager. This is an abused term or a overused term. General manager is assumed to be having an expertise in all the areas of the functions of management. So if you have a general manager for a store, say for a Tesco Extra store, that person is supposed to be an expert in finance, operations, HR management, sales, and customer services and things like that. So this is also a barrier, and that is where some companies look at segregating that function and then creating a separate HR, because you have to be all ears to your employees to be able to.
Hello. Hello.
Service. Sometimes quantified in terms of real, effect costs. So HR department would say that, okay, we've done this training and because of which the employees have become more productive and efficiency is increased. But can that be quantified in terms of the output which the employee is giving, in terms of more sales or more turnover or, more time that the employee is able to step in or, put in terms of its job role? Maybe not. So those kind of things are considered barriers, and perception assets and also incentives for change that might arise. So sometimes ideas given by the HR managers get shot down because they require a bit of additional investment or incentive. You must have seen within organizations, if you worked, in a place where in the services industry, what needs to happen is a lot of HR managers put forward a lot of incentives, to drive up, kind of feedback. For example, you do a lot of surveys. Sometimes, you buy something from Argos and you get a customer survey coming in saying that, okay, if you participate, you get a chance of being in a lucky draw and get so much pounds worth of free vouchers. Now, if you look at the same example within the HR department, sometimes HR has to offer, incentives or giveaways to be able to invite feedback or to be able to invite, participation. And this then tends to become one of the barriers because people put this into the back burner and say, okay, I'll probably be putting into, I'll be completing that survey, I'll get into a raffle draw, and as you know, only one will win it. So, they tend to then kind of become tasks which get, put back onto the burner. Now, some of the other things that we're looking at is what is the function in terms when we look at adding the word strategic to HR, what kind of things can strategic HRM accomplish in terms of resource management? And this is a beautiful slide which kind of summarizes that. So I've used some of these terms before today in terms of the presentation. Is one, it leads to increased performance. Strategic HR means they're looking at reskilling some of the workers. An example to explain this slide would be that if you imagine the same example of Jaguar Land Rover, and they are introducing a new lineup of, say, a car that is coming in. Now, their existing engineers, obviously the company is not recruiting new engineers or people who will be working on the new line. So what the HR department then gets a directive is that we need to retrain some of the good employees to be able to shift to another line wherein a new model is being introduced. And that, because it's a car model, you look at most car models last for 4 to 5 years in terms of their product life cycle. So it is a strategic shift because they're going to be training some of the employees which have been with the organization, perform consistently, can adhere to the new change in environment, will be trained to give, will be to basically adapt to those new production lines. And that function which the HR department does is then called strategic, because it is looking at picking up good employees or best employees from the lot, and they are going to be, it leads to increased performance because they're able to work both on the old line of the car and also on the new production line of the car. So they also look at something called enhanced shareholder value, because every time a new product has been introduced, it does not mean that the company will go out and recruit more resources in terms of people. They have to look at balancing the investment versus the output which is going to be received. That way, the HR function then strategically evaluates the effectiveness of staffing, retention, and selection of employees to fit it in a model wherein the production line also gets the required number of people required to work on the production line, but at the same time, the balance there's a balance which is achieved in the workforce within the shift or within the production floor. So those kind of things, when you look at, are looking at basically the outcomes of how personal management or HR then becomes strategic HR within a context of providing these things for an organization. Now, there are various models that we study in terms of frameworks. One of the clear frameworks that we look at studying in SHRM is Harvard framework model. And what I will do is, rather than go through this model particularly incorporates everything. And I'll send you a handout in the presentation. But when we look at the framework and models of how SHRM has been modeled over the years, there are lots of frameworks which have come up. And Harvard is one of such frameworks which is utilized by the HR managers because it incorporates and includes most of the function related to HRM. So, and incorporates, well and balances well with the strategic goals and objectives of the organization. So this particular model looks at incorporating corporate strategy, the business unit strategy, that means an individual departmental strategy, looks at the external and internal environment, considers what is the strategy which is going to be implemented by the HR department, and then the key needs it matches, things like staffing, training, performance management, compensation, and looking at complying with the legislation of the land or of the country. So, for example, here you look at the Employment Legislation Act, which of 1972. So it complies with such regulation and encompasses and gives you a complete picture of implementing the strategic HRM framework into an organization or into a particular department when it is being looked at from a holistic view. So this is the explanation of such model, and what I will do is I'll send you a handout which will explain the how SHRM model framework in a bit more detail. But this is how the model looks like, and that's why it's a popular model with most HR managers end up using. Now, what we are looking at doing is, in terms of a bit of additional reading today, which I'm going to send with regards to the pages that you need to look at for the book, will actually concentrate on understanding the function of HR and when it becomes strategic HR, and how does the SHRM in particular contributes to the overall organizational goal and achievement of organizational goal and objective. And that is what we will look at when I send you this particular handout. Now, one last thing before we close today's presentation we'll look at is that there are 5 key areas wherein SHRM is currently being applied by most organizations. And these are the 5 key areas that you see on the slide. So globalization, because there is a movement of labor happening now. That means you will have people moving in from one location to the other when the new operations are set up, even if it's on a temporary basis. You will see this is a key challenge. Profitability through growth is also a key challenge. That means when they deploy staff or hire staff, in the long run, the business has to be profitable and it has to achieve growth. That is why you're bringing in human resources, or you're bringing in the most important resource, which is able to control the other resources. The other challenges include technology, how technology is integrated in the use of physical resources, and how this resource in particular helps manage other resources. One such example could be communication through technology, which becomes quite important through email. So whenever a business sets up, the first thing that they look at in the office location would be that is there availability of broadband, telephone infrastructure, and things like that. The other bits which are key challenges are intellectual capital. That means intellectual property. So there are lots of things which organizations have created over the years. So when you look at Toyota, for example, as a company, as a motor company, they've introduced something called just-in-time system, which has become an intellectual capital. And that system has now been deployed all across in different organizations within the automotive industry. But just-in-time as a system basically meant that Toyota did not want to resource all the spare parts and materials required to be assembled into the car in their own plant. What they wanted was that the suppliers, partners, to supply most of them just in time before the production line was, kind of putting together that particular model or producing that particular car model. So that is also one of the key challenges. And then last but not the least, change or change management is also a very big key issue because there are lots of changes coming. The recent change that we looked at was that Uber, a lot of drivers in London, kind of sued the company Uber. And what they said is, okay, we are being self-employed, we've been taken advantage of, we do not get this pay, that pay. And they brought in a court case against Uber, which the court upheld. And because of which Uber is now looking at making changes to their, policies in terms of how they recruit drivers and things like that. Are you aware of that?
Yeah.
So there are continuous changes happening in that context, and that is also becoming quite important from a point of view of managing it, and that is why it is also classified under the strategic HR role. Now, you know this quite well. This is something which is quite common. HR is responsible for defining organizational structure as a model for the company's way of doing business. So when you look at departmentalization, you look at creation of a structure within the department, most of these things are done in tandem with the HR department. So they will put in a structure saying that, okay, this department will have a head of marketing, will have this, will have that, and then they tend to then make that person accountable by providing a job role or a job description and the achievables that that person needs to be able to do when the annual appraisals happen across the year. So they define the structure, they make the person accountable by providing job descriptions, and in some cases, what they also tend to do is they tend to kind of into these roles or jobs and responsibilities in terms of review mechanism, and that is done through the process of doing annual appraisals or 360-degree appraisals once a year, which helps set clear targeted opportunities, but at the same time also puts a review mechanism in place for that particular person to be able to become answerable. A typical example of this would be when you look at the House of Commons in our Parliament. What tends to happen is there are select committees, and sometimes these select committees bring the chief executives of different organizations to their meetings, and they ask them to answer difficult questions. Their role as within the government, if you look at select committee, their role is the role of an HR or a strategic HR department, where they hold the corporate companies or the government departments accountable by doing these reviews. And they are, if you watch, channel 505, I think 504, which is the Parliament channel, or when you look at some of the interviews which the select parliamentary committees do, they are basically doing nothing but a strategic function of acting as a check and balance against the government policies which have been introduced and how these policies are interpreted by the large corporate organizations, and then may hold them accountable by doing those interviews or calling them for those select committee meetings. Now we also look at HR can also bring across a cultural change, and this is something which, can you give an example how HR brings across a cultural change? So give you an example here of a cultural change would be that, as you know, that we took an example of companies like Google, Facebook and Apple, wherein they're now making a provision within the HR for employees to be able to work from home, right? Now, this is a cultural change is because of the requirements, keeping in mind the requirements of, the say employees. Say for example, one, as you know, the cost of infrastructure in terms of rentals and offices is quite high in London. A lot of companies look at saving costs. So what they do is they operate out of offices which are Regus offices or offices where you have shared offices, premises, then the employee can go and use the office premise for printing, video conferencing, meeting, things like that. Now, the other bit that you look at when you look at a cultural change is because what they realize is that a lot of their employees in London spend a lot of time in commuting. So commuting from Milton Keynes or outskirts of London and coming to the office in central London. So that time can be better utilized if they can only be asked to come in certain days of the week rather than throughout the week from Monday to Friday. And the third bit what they look at is in most companies, what they do is they also build in the cost of the train tickets and provide some sort of an annual, train, pass to the employees in the overall compensation structure. So now a lot of companies are looking at keeping the requirements of flexi working, working from home, traveling time, and also the facilities the employee uses when they are in the office from a point of view of overall cost perspective. So the cultural change which is now being brought in is that slowly and gradually HR department is now allowing some of the employees to work from home, and this is allowing the company to be able to save money and also seeing a bit of increase in productivity because the time which the employee saves in terms of travel is then seen as increased productivity when they are working from home or they are working from a local office. So that is, a cultural change that HR is helping to bring across within most global organizations because of the changing requirements of working, culture in general within the large organizations. Now, let's look at some of the changes which typically tend to happen, which are directly related to, I would say HR, but they are, related to HR from a point of view of, let's look at, say, operational management. So sometimes HR basically looks at communicating all major changes within the organization. Example here is you have a change in the CEO or you have a change in leadership, the HR will normally send out an email. And some of these things sometimes happen quite subtly is because if the chief executive is resigned or if this person in the senior management is resigned, the HR department has the responsibility to be able to kind of provide leadership and take over that particular department till a new person is found. Some of the other things which you look at in terms of the operational activities which they do is they also look at within their department upgrading and investing in their own professionals to be able to have current knowledge. A lot of HR departments here over the last few years have incorporated something called guidelines on usage of IT and cyber security within the job descriptions of most of their employees. Now this has happened is because the usage of internet over the years has become more and more important, and what they do is they've created a policy or a process which clearly defines how employees, when they are working for an organization, can use Facebook, Twitter, or some of these mediums which communicate to external environments from a point of view of company's position. So these are practices which the HR has to upgrade, keeping in mind as it moves ahead with the changing technology. So there are lots of changes which HR is adapting to the last few years, and this is because of the communication becoming faster, much more efficient, and the integration, very tighter integration of technology within the working of most companies. Is that okay?
That's fine, yeah.
Now, let's look at, human capital management. So when you look at cost centers, a lot of times what tends to happen is, Alex, for example, you've started a new business, and what tends to happen is you've started a new business, you have a few colleagues who are, you have a partner, and what you tend to do is you will have a discussion with him because you would want to put in or bring in somebody who can take over a particular function because you feel that the business is now grown and you will not be able to perform two functions. So between the two partners, yourself and the other partner, what you do is you sit down and decide that, okay, if we have to recruit a new person, that new person would be able to come in and do 1, 2, 3, 4 jobs. And I think these kind of jobs, if he does, then this could be the compensation or the salary that we will pay that particular person. Now, when that tends to happen, you will normally see that what you're trying to do is you're trying to basically fix a particular salary or a particular value to the kind of function you were expecting that person to come in and perform. And that is within the remits of you planning something called capital. You're planning human capital management. That means you're planning the resource, but you're also planning in which you're planning on the side that if these are the functions which this particular person is able to do, this is the salary that that person will be able to draw. So sometimes what you get to see is, to become effective HR managers have to understand key things which are in line with the requirements of the business. And a typical example that I will give here would be that sometimes what happens is there's a new job which has to be put out. The HR manager will basically revert back to the department head or the functional person to be able to help him put together a job description. Do you know why does this happen?
Yeah.
Now, this happens because if they are looking at say recruiting an engineer within a particular function, what the person in HR would know is what kind of skill set would that engineer be required. So according to that skill set, they will do a bit of research to see, okay, if we are wanting an engineer who is able to build apps on the iPhone and Android, we need this particular skill set. But the HR manager is not aware of this. So he speaks to the department head or the engineering department, director, whatever, and then gets this few requirements in place that, okay, the person should know Python, should know Cocoa, should know basic, things of handling and programming and things like that. And once he gets that as a skill set, he then kind of measures it in the market in terms of what other companies are actually paying to recruit this kind of engineer. What is the value at which this engineer is coming in? Does that make sense?
Okay, right, yeah.
The HR manager then needs to develop the knowledge or get the knowledge of which particular function the person will come in and work, and what kind of skill set will be required will come from somebody when he interacts with that functional expert within that department. So sometimes you will get to see in companies like, not sometimes, you get to see this in companies like Google, Facebook, the HR managers tend to be specific within departments, is because they have the functional expertise, and over the years, what they've done is they've specialized in managing the HR function. So somebody like a solutions architect who's been working within Google search engine, for example, for 10 years or 12 years, has then over the years been developed to manage the HR side of things within that department, and he then becomes a functional expert. So he is then able to realize the cost of bringing a new engineer in, but also knows the skill set which is required for that particular person to be recruited. And that person then has the knowledge of the business, has the knowledge of being in that department in terms of the expertise required, and last but not the least, is able to recruit more successfully than the HR manager in the traditional case. So this then becomes the human capital management side of things when we look at strategic HR. Now, there are some of the new functions which are coming in for HR, and they are summarized on this slide, which is things, how HR needs to now focus on business outcomes rather than the, usual day-to-day operations. They need to look at now they need to be able to understand the strategic vision of the company, and then align the resources, training and development, so that they do not become a market follower, but basically become a market leader. And some of the competencies which are required now in HR side are required from a point of view of looking at developing functional expertise. That means, give an example earlier was pensions, for example. There is a person within the HR department who now manages pensions. There's a person within the department who now manages training and development. But if you look at 20 years back, or 2 decades or 3 decades back, there was one person which was primarily managing all this within the department. So resource management from that aspect is also becoming quite specialist. Last but not the least, what we look at is, I'm going to send you some additional reading material on, culture. and how does HR actually focus and look at shaping up the culture within the organization, and how the culture within an organization shapes the overall HR strategy. So these are things that we are going to look at progressively when we go forward and look at the second learning outcome next week, which is in terms of how do we develop human resources within an organization. And sometimes it's the culture of the organization. So when you look at Google, for example, the culture of the organization seems to be quite employee friendly. So there are gyms, spas, saunas, pods, and cafes and everything within the organization, because they generally that if the employees are taken care of, then it leads to more productivity, more efficiency, and the culture of the organization looks and feel quite cool. And then they are able to attract the best possible talent from outside to be able to be recruited in the organization, for the purposes of furthering their business objectives. So that is where we're going to stop today. And what I'm going to do is, obviously, after the session, send you a copy of this presentation, and then also include one or two good handouts which are required to put the flesh on the bones in terms of the Harvard model, which is primarily followed in the SHRM, and then one or two handouts related to the aspects of how do we look at the importance of SHRM within the organization today, and what are the key contributions which SHRM actually makes in towards the achievement of organizational aims and objectives. So I'm going to end here today. Thank you so much for attending, and I will catch up with you via email or phone. If you have any queries, as always, please feel free to send that across on the email. Okay, thanks a lot for this. Thank you. Bye.